Welcome to the 2016 Compliance, Confined Space, and Technical Rescue Awareness Refresher. Let's start with a look at our Confined Space SOP. What is a confined space? By our SOP, it defines it as large enough to bodily enter, has limited entry or egress, it's not designed for continuous occupancy, and it has a hazardous atmosphere, or could have a hazardous atmosphere, and could have converging or sloping walls. Some examples are coming up on the screen now. As you look around the outside pictures here, these are all examples of things that are in our town or the surrounding area. So let's look at what an entry is as defined by our SOP. Okay. Our SOP basically defines an entry by one of our members anytime the respiratory system crosses that opening, that plane of the confined space. Some of the hazards that our SOP defines: there's limited access, unknown atmosphere, which is why air monitoring is critical. We'll talk about that later. Energy sources, we get into lockout, tagout to take care of some energy source problems. Explosive or flammable materials, mechanical equipment, again, lockout, tagout becomes important. Lack of communication, biological, and anything else. Our SOP defines some key players: the attendant, the authorized entrant, and the qualified person. We'll look at each individually coming up here. The attendant. The attendant's job is to be on the outside of the space to monitor the entrants as they go in, to make sure they're okay, they have everything they need. His job is to call for help if anything does go wrong and the entrants do need help. He requires proper training to be able to fulfill that position. At a minimum, he must be certified in CPR. He has to have a way to communicate for help. The authorized entrant is the person that's actually making entry into the space to do whatever the work may be. In our case, it may very well be a rescue or a recovery. Our SOP defines what a qualified person is. SOP goes on to say that we shall use ICS just like any other emergency incident we respond to. The incident commander is going to have to appoint an operations officer and a safety officer at a minimum. So we have 3 people at a minimum in play here. EMS. The incident commander shall also coordinate with the EMS. The appropriate number of BLS and ALS must be on location. An additional BLS will be committed solely to the entry team. The incident commander shall also coordinate with the police department. The police department shall be responsible for scene control and the staging area. Entry procedures. We must always remember to monitor the atmosphere before making any kind of entry. We're checking for oxygen levels, lower explosive limits, and toxicity. We must remember to meter all levels of a space, as the chemicals will tend to layer themselves based on their vapor density. Our MX6 with the sampling pump and the probe is the tool of choice for this. Remember, we could have clean air at the top of space, but it could be a completely different story at the bottom of the space. We must provide for respiratory protection. We may need to provide ventilation with an electric fan. We must complete a permit. Attendants must be named. And entrants require a minimum level of PPE as listed below. The attendant must maintain communications with the entrance. And anyone may order a stop to the operation at any time for safety reasons. When the incident's over, the IC must ensure that debriefing occurs and maintain any written documentation for the record. That was a look at our confined space SOP. Now we're going to take a look at confined space knowledge in general, starting with the exposure routes, how these chemicals can get in our body. We can inhale them, ingest them, absorb them, or they could be injected into us. And the effects may be chronic or acute, immediate or delayed, local or systemic. Here are some terms we need to be familiar with when we're talking about confined spaces. We also need to know our oxygen limitations. Anything greater than 23.5 we consider oxygen rich, less than 19.5 we consider oxygen deficient. When we have oxygen rich, the flammability ranges of our chemicals expand. When we're oxygen deficient, we can no longer breathe. Now we're going to take a look at some common chemicals associated with confined spaces, beginning with hydrogen sulfide. You can see here the explosive limits, the IDLH of 300 parts per million, and it has a 1.2 vapor density, meaning it's going to be heavier than air, or found at the lower regions of our spaces. Methane gas, again you see the explosive limitations there, and a 0.5 vapor density, meaning it's lighter than air, or it's going to be higher in our space, or coming out of the top of our spaces. Carbon monoxide, again 75% upper flammability range, 12% lower flammability range, 1500 parts per million IDLH, and a 0.97 vapor density, almost the same as air. Carbon dioxide, a 5% IDLH, 10% can render unconsciousness. It has a 1.5 vapor density, again another heavy gas going to be low in space. Nitrogen dioxide, 50 parts per million IDLH, and another heavy gas, 1.6 vapor density. OSHA has several requirements for a confined space program. Let's take a look at the entry permit. An original must be kept at the office, and a copy must be kept at the entry to the space while the work's going on. It must describe the hazards of the space, and describe the minimum acceptable conditions for entry. It specifies a person in charge. It names the attendant. It assures a rescue team is available, and it is signed by the supervisor, attendant, and the entrance. A lockout-tagout program must also be in place to ensure that entry is safe into equipment. Here are some examples of lockout-tagout devices. Now we're going to take a look at the initial operations, say for the engine company arriving on scene. A witness or a responsible party can provide a lot of valuable information for the rescue team. Please Please follow along with the following videos to practice each knot listed below. confined space rescue and rope rescue go hand in hand. It is therefore important that we understand what rope equipment we have in the district and where it is. The white utility rope that is found in each piece of apparatus is not life safety rope. 1038 and the tech rescue trailer each contain a red bag and a blue bag with hardware and 200 feet of life safety rope. A staple piece of equipment for confined space entry is the tripod. Our tripod is located on Rescue 1038. This diagram illustrates the importance to keep the load within the framework of the tripod. If the person in this picture were to pull outside the tripod, as depicted by letter A, the tripod would easily fall over in his direction. It is therefore important to keep the pull or the haul within the framework of the tripod. This concludes the presentation portion of the confined space refresher. You may now continue on to complete the written test and the hands-on portion of the training.